So I guess just to get things started on the logistical part, I guess we have this discussion lined up till 10 o'clock. Yeah, Juma? And then you have I think, interaction with a law firm partner who's apparently just visiting the campus. Um, yeah, his name is Vinod Surana. It's I'm as clueless as you are, so that's okay. But Sean mentioned that it would be because we're meeting also in the afternoon once. I think that's a completely different domain that of discussion. But Sean said that we can probably wrap up this session by 10, and then have your interaction scheduled in. I believe so. I'm Deep. I'm Dipanshu Mohan, so short for Deep. So you can probably just uh, have just your first names brought into the light, if that's okay with you. I hope you got some time for breakfast this morning. Yeah, before coming in. All right, that's nice. Okay, can we just have just you guys telling me your first names and which college are you from? Or I believe all of you from Murdoch. No, I think there's some of you from Monash. Um, and some of you from ANU as well? No, ANU is a separate delegation. Yeah, yeah. Wow.
Okay, I'm Peter. I'm studying commerce and law from Monash University.
Okay.
I'm Eva from Monash.
Okay.
Lucy from Monash.
Lucy.
I'm Rita. I'm also from Monash.
Gabriel from Monash.
And Tara from Monash. Maria from Monash. Elise from Monash.
Elise.
Jocelyn. I'm also from Monash.
Yes.
Emily Monash as well. Nicole. I'm from Murdoch. Anastasia. I'm from Murdoch. Poppy from Murdoch.
Sam from Murdoch.
Ajay.
AJ from Murdoch.
Joel from Murdoch.
Rahul from Monash.
Alana from Monash.
Mohit from GT.
Okay. One from JC. Oh, that's fine. It's great. So you guys want to just grab a chair and somehow I think find a space that side, or is it okay? You're comfortable, right? Okay. So just only one sign I need from your end. How many of you have had at any point of time in your young adult lives a course in economics taught at any point of time? A course in economics means basically something that was taught which had to do with, there is something like demand and supply and some weird graphs that are shown. So something that at some point of you did. Okay, even if you didn't do it, or even you didn't have economics as a course, one of the things that I wanted to do, at least this part of our discussion, was to give you some numbers of indicators, right, in terms of how the economy seems to be performing. So this part of our discussion, it is the morning part, is going to be a bit number centric, all right, while we are trying to shape in the discussion, looking at what these numbers reflect. No equations, nothing, of course, but I hope that's fine, all right. But one thing I really want you to be very honest about, at any point of time when you feel lost, like, okay, this just completely flew by, I just want you to give me a sign that, okay, need to recapture it, because it seems to me that I'm covering, if you had a chance to look at the brief description of each of the lectures, I guess some references were shared as well. This discussion can be, I don't know, tabled or timeline for almost an entire month. We can have discussions on each part, but I'm trying to just bring in the broader points. So let me get started. I teach courses in development economics and international economics here. As you would have seen by now, the university being largely quite interdisciplinary makes us to interact with students primarily from the schools that we haven't had much exposure to. So I've had the chance to teach a lot of law school students, and that gives often an idea on how to be able to discuss or bring some points across. So the students, the school that I'm affiliated with is the School of International Affairs. But as of our discussion today, what I wanted to do was to bring across not only the points on looking at how the Indian economy is functioning right now. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at even one of the newspapers, but for the time duration that you're there for a couple of weeks, If you just pick up newspapers like the Indian Express or just go on their website or Mint, for example, these are a couple of popular news dailies that are coming out. I think almost 80% of the newspaper content is focusing on what's going wrong with the Indian economy. And some of these problems are largely structural in nature, but some of them seem to be ones that have emerged over the last 1 year or 1.5 years or so. So the last delegation from Murdoch that came, I think the timing of that delegation was right 1 month after this policy measure called demonetization that was introduced. And I recall my conversations with the delegation students. They were having a lot of difficult times in getting money, right, and converted. So the discussion topic was supposed to be in something else, but we had just an entire an hour discussion on the challenges they were facing and how was that affecting the economy. So I do want to briefly discuss demonetization and the recent tax that we have implemented. That's the goods and services tax. But that comes right at the flag end. Maybe I'll probably start the next lecture by discussing that. But the first point I wanted us to kind of reflect on is largely not about the Indian economy, but with the discipline of economics as a whole, all right? And this is largely something which has been echoed primarily over the last decade, if I can say, since the US financial crisis happened in 2006, 2007, 2008, and spilled over right across to Europe. Australia per se was not deeply impacted by the crisis per se, but as a result of the global slowdown in productivity standards, Australia did. I think one of the reasons why you see a deeper engagement with a country like China that Australia did was a deviation to be less dependent on markets in Europe, because Europe markets tanked as a result of the US financial crisis. But I think one of the things that brought out was that maybe economists, and not the discipline economics per se, are, I think, too dependent on using mathematical modeling as a measure to understand what's happening in the economy as a whole. And while we can have a longer discussion on when it started, but the narrowing down in terms of the methodology of investigation that started, let's say in the 60s and the 70s, with the financial innovations taking place in the US, somewhere economists stopped looking at interlinkages of how societies are functioning, not only with the advancement of the circulation of money per se, but also on the effects on using, for example, debt or the raise in the level of prices, something which we call as inflation. How is that all impacting people as a whole or society as a whole is something which was in a way lost by most of the narrowing down scene. But why is that? Why did that happen? I think that's a separate discussion. But what I wanted, at least for us to start by looking at our discussion today, is to have a brief idea on how the methodology right now is being questioned on a lack of a narrative based approach in the discipline of economics. So what do I actually mean when I use the word narrative? Or what would you mean if I said that economics as a discipline lacks a narrative style or doesn't have a taste for narratives? Or the word narrative, what would that mean? Yeah, I mean, I can speak for hours, but if somebody just asks you, okay, use of narratives is important, so yeah.
Maybe some kind of personal story that relates to the people.
Exactly. So I mean, this is largely looking at not only social psychology, but generally the psychology of optimal well-being. Most of economics was largely dependent on how well-being can be maximized, right? There are different ways. Some people can be satisfied with a lot of money. Some people can be satisfied with wonderful relationships or whatever. But the idea seems to be primarily too that the level of happiness or the well-being is maximized by one's exposure to his or her engagement in the society and the people one meets with, right? And I think most of us may agree that the stories we get to learn And by the time that we will probably finish the visit here to India this time, it will hardly be about the lectures you've had. I think it would mostly be about the experiences you've had in terms of your interaction with people and their own stories, right? So they would start discussing different examples of situations, so over lunch, over dinners, or I don't know, or your visit to the Taj or whatever. So whatever is that you're going to observe is the narrative that you're going to shape and form of not only, unfortunately, the whole country as a whole, because your exposure is also very limited, but narratives help us in giving us a very good contextual idea as some form of a storytelling exercise, right? The unit of that story or the protagonist of that story may be an individual with complex set of emotions, right? But one of the things that seems to be more certain is that we do use a story-based approach to be able to communicate a certain emotion or a feeling. Now, in the discipline of economics, while that was classical texts, reading of Smith and most of the Adam Smith or David Hume, most of the people you'd read have often used narratives as the basic way of approach of how they communicated what's happening in the society. Unfortunately, over the last 30 to 40 years, the narratives have died down. We've had complex modeling that have been brought out, and somehow that has led to a universalized approach to solving some very contextual problems, if you know what I mean. So we start briefly by discussing what is the role or what could be the role of narratives in the very basic framework of economic analysis. And this extends to the idea of how we understand the very concept of growth, right? And I want us primarily to distinguish the concept of growth with the idea of how development plays. Somehow these two terms and concepts are quite relationally used as one or synonymously used as one or the other. But growth as a process, how economics looks at it, is only one of the processes which can lead to the development of an individual or a society as a whole, right? The idea of growth is mostly related with how much a country or a particular society can produce. 500 years ago, the production was limited to a particular household. Right? When I say a household, that just look at it, a family, right? A family of 6 or a family of 60, doesn't matter. But the family was working largely engaged in farming, and as a result of what they were producing, they were consuming the same, right? Whatever extra was left over, they would trade that off, and that's how trade emerged. In fact, the very word economics comes from a word oikonomia, which is the economics of the household. So household is something which was the very fundamental unit. It's only with the evolution of how analysis framed that over the last 400 years or so, the household became only one of the units, and then there was a discussion on how the government plays a role, how corporate or firms plays a role in how the society is formed. So start briefly with that, and then I think given the time we have, I'll just discuss some of the macroeconomic challenges and take forward the discussion. All right. Now, if you just look at so I hope most of you know what JSTOR is. It's just a database which has a lot of research articles across the board, right? So if you just type the word narrative and you want to study and see which discipline has used the word narrative the most, which are the two disciplines that you would find that has most often used the word narrative or has a taste for narratives or stories? History, okay. Which is the other? Anthropology, right? So history and anthropology, and that's important. Anthropology is largely brained on, so most of you turn anthropologists when you're going for a dinner right at, let's say Chokirani, for example, and when you're spending some time interacting with the locals. In fact, you're doing ethnography right there. It may be shorthand, but you're still making an attempt to understand various cultural practices, and that's where narratives become so important. Same with history. I mean, history as a methodology as well has seen a lot of methods evolve, but the narrative is the core in how history and understanding of history is shaped. The narrative could be of a country, could be of an event, could be of an individual, right? Which has the least use of the word narratives here? Finance, of course, right? Because somehow there's a universalized assumption that using money as some form of a common identity. But while in Australia you may use an Australian dollar, the Indian rupee is completely different. So any kind of financial measurement that you would do for the Australian dollar, which is softly fixed with the fixed supply of the US dollar as well, and it changes to its value. The Indian rupee is an emerging currency and has not much of the same power. But in any case, the Indian rupee or the Australian dollar do not qualify as two different stories in the field or the work of finance, because you're using set models to put in the data that is there. Same goes with economics. Psychology and sociology, on the other hand, have more a form of a mixed set. So what we do get as an idea of bringing this narrative-based approach is we can probably club these into 4 perspectives, and I think that would just help us in shaping what we're trying to argue by looking at the India story as one which is unique and of its own, right? So when you're talking about growth in India, it's not as if that you can compare the situation of India with China, or you can compare it with any other large developing country. You can't compare it with Brazil, you can't compare. In fact, comparison becomes extremely different because the kind of narratives that are coming from the analysis itself are very different, right? So, and that's one of the reasons why I've used the word here. So if you use a more of a storytelling technique to understand the Indian growth story over the last couple of decades, it's important for at least one could club as 4 different perspectives when you get. The first perspective is what we can call as a humanist perspective or a humanist perspective. So demonetization may be a policy, but the way it is implemented affects people, and people not as only as a group, but also as individuals, as who are a part of that group, right? And if 80% of the individuals do not have money to be able to withdraw from the banks that they have an account of, or they do not have cash to do their regular transactions, you would say that that's affecting their livelihood, right? Would you say that? Yes or no? Yeah. So if something is affecting your livelihood, one would really question whether the government's objective, no matter how good that may be, is likely to benefit the society as a whole or not, right? So the humanist perspective is largely looking at the perspective of individual stakeholders, right, who are recipients or are affected by the implementation of a given policy. Why I'm using the word policy is a tool by which the government acts. And a government can be seen as a subset of the state, right? We can have then a lot of discussions in political philosophy of what the state and the government and separation of powers is, but largely government works through policies, and policies do have an impact on how society works. Unfortunately, most policies are framed out of a given common understanding of what is good or what is bad for people as a group as a whole. So the humanist perspective tells us, well, probably in a given situation, this may be good for X number of people, right? The second perspective you may get by using the narrative of a particular implementation scenario may be that of context. And this is important. Context becomes extremely important in a field like anthropology. If there is an anthropologist who's worked for 15 years in let's say, Fiji, right, and has spent, let's say, 5 months in India, right, in Delhi, there's not much that one would be able to comment on how the cultural settings in Delhi are working as against what happens in Fiji. He would be more of an expert for you to be able to give you an idea on how Fiji's contextual narrative works as against what is Delhi's scenario. And vice versa. There could be someone who may be spending 15 years here doing ethnography or anthropological work. So context is something which is extremely important in situating the functioning of an economy as a whole given the social, political, and cultural arrangements of that particular situation, right? So context becomes then as a perspective to add. The third is a behavioral perspective, and I'm not quite sure if you know, but a lot of economics right now is being questioned on understanding whether the rationality presumption makes sense. So what does this rationality presumption means? We assume somehow as economists that each one of you try to take actions on a day-to-day basis on a self-interest maximizing principle. So whatever else you do, it's just maximizing your self-interest in some way or the other. Now, that's difficult to explain in a system where, for example, you take a car from here and you go to the next traffic signal, wherever it is working, and you stop there and just get an idea of, and there is a team of 4 people, 4 children coming and asking for money, right? And they're begging for money, and you say, well, okay, I'm recently cashed up, and I'm also sympathetic to looking at poor people, so I just take out a 100-rupee note and I give that. Now, the question that one would like to ask is, how does that action and the use of money, in fact, is maximizing your own self-interest while you're doing that as an act of a behavioral action, right? Human beings are naturally capable of being sympathetic. They are or they're not, that's a different scenario, but they are naturally capable of being sympathetic. How would you explain that in a rationalized model? Almost 90% of economic analysis based on what we call as rational choice theory, RCT, right? And that's something which a lot of people have questioned, particularly psychologists. The recent Nobel Prize winner, Richard Thaler, is one of the leading behavioral economists in the world who has constantly challenged this presumption. You may want to look at a book called Misbehaving or Nudge if you are interested in reading his work. I think these are just kind of more like self-help books, but brilliant texts. So the behavioral perspective is important. How in a given narrative, the executive body involved from implementing the policy till the time people who are affected by it, how their behavior is changing. I may put a dustbin right here or a trash can right here, but if people behaviorally are used to putting trash right here and not put in the bin, not much that you can do, right? I can offer the logistics. So one would say, what is the way you correct for this mechanism is that the next time you keep trash on the table, you're going to be fined $100, right? So you'll be very cautious on not using the trash can the next time. So the behavioral perspective becomes important. The last is the agency perspective. Now, what is the agency perspective? How does a law student understand or define the word agency? I think most of you are law school students, yeah. So if I use the word agency, what comes to your mind?
Somebody that acts on behalf of the principal.
Someone who acts on behalf of the principal, okay? Make sense? Okay. Who's the principal? In the functioning of an economy, you're absolutely right. If we also look at principal-agent problems, so principal could be a firm, and agency could be the labor that is working for it, right? But let me tweak that around a little bit. In an extremely patriarchal system, when I say patriarchy, I think you understand the word, male-dominated, right? Patriarchal system. What is the agency of women within the household? Would you say that the principal there acts as the man and woman, or let's say his wife, acts on behalf of the man? No, you'd say that here the word agency would be used independent of the principal, right? And in fact, I don't know if you look at it, but most of the feminist jurisprudence that emerges over the last 50, 60 years, and particularly Indian feminist literature, has contradicted the idea of the principal-agent relationship. They've said that the agency or the notion of agent is sometimes, in some cases, independent of the principal. and you can justify in cases of talking about individual human beings when you talk. And this is also a framework of how the libertarian philosophy emerged, because the individual and his or her rights became more important, which is not conditionally dependent on someone else's functioning, right? So while we do understand the idea of the agency perspective in relation to the principal actor, we do distinguish it, however, when we start looking at intra-household mechanisms. So the word intra-household means within the household, and inter-household may be within, like between households. So agency perspective, using a narrative-based approach, will give you an idea how various agencies are involved. If the principal actor is the state, right, and the state is working through the institutions that are working for the state, whether it's a democratic state or an authoritarian state, how are the agencies working or being able to carry out a given policy is something which is extremely important. One of the biggest flaws that was cited with the implementation of what I was just saying of demonetization, for example, was seen to be that the banks themselves were found to be incapable of accept money in exchange from people, and also offer money of new denominations at the same time, right? Okay, by the way, how many of you know what is demonetization? Because I'm using that as a reference somewhere. Do you know what demonetization was as a policy measure? In the Australian Parliament also, a lot of people were discussing that we should try something similar. I don't know, I think some wisdom came probably over the year with the evidence coming out, and a lot of people started questioning it. It was simply 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, which included 80% of India's money supply, were withdrawn overnight. In other words, they lost their validity as a legal tender overnight, after which people was given a time of a couple of weeks, or in fact 6 weeks to be precise, to turn all the cash they had with the bank. This was done as a corrective measure to check for black money. When I say black money, so reduce the cash with people and put it with the banks, right? We'll probably discuss more about it. So using a narrative-based approach in economic analysis helps us in getting more or less of these perspectives. I think this is clear. Humanist perspective, contextual perspective, behavioral idea, and agency perspective. Does that make sense? We're just starting in terms of the framework here. Is that all right? Or do you want me to get back to anything? Okay. Let's look at, what is?
It's just a roll.
Okay. We can put it later. Don't worry. I'll give you time for it. Okay. Later, I don't want it to. So let's look at one of such narratives. If you're talking about narratives as one particular story, let's take India as one narrative as a whole. All right? So think of India as a living person, or as one unit of your assessment. Okay? And we're talking about the Indian story here. And the Indian story with respect to what we understand by the concept of growth. So how has India made an attempt to maximize its production possibilities in order to secure the well-being of its people? Somehow, the idea is if you have a high level of GDP, that's gross domestic product, that means you're producing more as an economy on an annual basis, you are likely to be reflecting a more promising growth story, okay? So if your growth situation is being only measured by production, that means more and more people who are being educated will be put in that assembly line of production, right? I need education not because I need to be informed and well learned, but I need to learn exactly what the industry demands me to offer, right? So you law students because you want to meet a law firm partner to understand how the industry is functioning, and all the education is being looked at that part. So the role of the Indian growth narrative becomes extremely important. There are two questions that we tend to look upon. I don't think we'll be able to cover both of them. The first, definitely we can look at that. In economic reasoning, the term micro means something which is the smallest unit, right? And macro is something that you scale up as a whole. So when I use the word household, you can include one household and that would be a micro unit. And if you use households of the entire state of Haryana, for example, that would become a macro aggregate. Okay, so I think that distinction needs clarification. Okay, the second question which we would address probably in the second half of the lecture is to look at the idea whether India's growth narrative has actually picked up over the last couple of decades or so with the reforms that have taken place, whether the ability of India as an economy to produce more has actually led to a benefit for the people living in, or is it just something which has benefited to a few people who were able to make most of the reforms as against the other. And this feeds into largely in today's time the inequality discourse that is also happening. Inequality is not something which you see only in terms of income standards. You can also see it in terms of social well-being, hierarchies of class, which is something that you study in the field of sociology. But in India's case, class is one of the least variable of distinction. Which will be the variable of distinction for those who have some idea? Social inequality would be based on what? If class is not a variable. When I use the word class, I say, well, you have a certain level of income or wealth. I have a property with me, so I'm higher off.
Is it caste?
Yeah, so the use of caste becomes important because from where are you coming in from? So you have to just pick up a newspaper like a Times of India or something, especially the Sunday edition, and you have to skim through the entire thing, and there's one matrimonial section. That's something which you must look at, right? And there's a matrimonial section which is very clearly asking, this is the caste I am from, and this is the caste that I'm looking for in terms of a bride or a groom. And there are exact clear classifications. Doesn't matter how educated you are. In fact, there are specific demands. I need someone who is settled in Australia and Brisbane. It's a lovely family, but I need someone from this caste to get married. Anyway, so that's something which is the way in which how inequality works. So what are the dualities that are shaping the structure of policy making, right? That's something which we'll look about. So the five key major challenges that are affecting the economy as of right now, and which we can say are also structural in nature. When I use the word structural, then one can say that this has been present for at least the last 60 years or so, since the time when India became independent as a nation and got its identity. Then you can see that most of these problems have not only stayed on, but also widened in parts of the country. The first problem, and the title here seems to be calling it the micro to macro challenge. So while these problems may be seen as macro problems that is affecting the country as a whole, in your interactions you'll find that some of these problems are actually affecting an individual family as well at the same level. The issue of jobs, the issue of gender inequality, the issue of nourishment levels, the issue of, for example, lack of access to primary healthcare or education is something that you see right from one. So you can use one family or a group of families as a unit of assessment, or you can use the entire economy. You'll find similarities in terms of validation. All right. The first point, which means, and it's titled the sectoral performance gaps. Almost by the time India became independent, almost 80% of our labor was employed by the agricultural sector, right? So agriculture means largely doing farming using manual methods, not mechanized methods. And most of what was needed at that time, which the government also thought through its planning mechanism, was to improve the performance of the agricultural sector and the people working in it, so largely the farmers. You see that the performance of these sectors today, so the agricultural sector, manufacturing sector, I think do you know the trajectory? There's a primary sector, there's a secondary sector, there's a tertiary sector, right? Any country to be able to grow consistently, not grow at one pace, but grow consistently over the longer period of time, needs a transition between primary, secondary, and tertiary. Tertiary includes what? Services. So financial services, banking, telecom would be a part of services. You'd have your secondary sector including what? Industries and manufacturing. So how many jeans are you producing, how many apparel are you producing, how much of, so basically manufacturing or production, how many tin pots are you producing, right? And the primary sector is the one which is feeding into the raw material or providing the raw material. That's primarily the agribusiness. I think that's something which is clear. In India's case, and which is so unique, and that's why it's a narrative of its own, we've not seen that transition. You've not seen the transition from primary to secondary to tertiary. In fact, you only see post 90s a direct transition somehow into the tertiary sector. So you have excellent mobile banking services. You can actually get a SIM very easily. In fact, this is one of the best and most competitive telecom markets in the entire world, I would say. I'm yet to come across a country which has data, such as mobile data or internet data, provided at this cheap a price, right? So it's done tremendously. It's grown after the 90s. It's not like a long story as well. So that's evolved. You have shipping services that have actually done pretty well. IT, that means information technology. So I think most of you are familiar with the Indian engineers and the computer scientists that tend to come out from the south. So all of that has been demarcated of how well the service sector has done, right? While the agricultural sector and its performance has been pretty low. So if we just look at the data for the last 3 or 4 decades or so, from the 1980s, because 1980 becomes an important point after which India's government or political regime makes an active effort to undertake certain reforms, right? If you see, this is only pointing you out the contribution of each sector to the overall growth level. When I say the overall growth level, that's the overall GDP. So how much if one sector is promoting to the overall GDP. So just tell me at the top of your hand, what do you see as a trend happening between 80 to 2006? Let's start with the agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector starts from around 1980 and it goes on to 3.4% in between, or let's say 2.1% between the decade of 81-88. But if you look at the period between 1988 and 2006, it comes down to 3.4. So agricultural, forestry and fisheries was contributing more to the income of the overall country way back in 1980 as against what it is doing today, right? Is that one observation that you make? This is the first column, or the second column. Industry, what about industry? Industry was contributing around 8%. Now it seems to be contributing an aggregate around 6.5 over the last few decades. Manufacturing was 8, it's now 6.8. Services, on the other hand, was 5.4, but now as a result of what we were just discussing, it's adding to the most amount of the GDP, right? 7.8. So the overall GDP you see is 6.3, and I'm using the word GDP, I'm saying that only production capacity. So I think that's something which is clear. So how much is that India is producing is largely dependent on how well its services are doing. So we are actually dependent very closely on how pharmaceuticals is doing, how banking is doing, how telecom is doing. And that's something which has been suffering over the last couple of years, being responsible for the slight dip that we've seen. Let me segregate that in different trends. Now this is giving an idea of the last 5 years. And if you just look at this, the ratio of the service sector in the overall GDP, you see that the service sector is large, which we just pointed out. Industry sector has grown, but not grown up to what it has. In fact, you see a reverse analogy. It's tertiary sector to secondary sector to primary sector, not the other way around, right? You expect the cycle to be the way in which how traditional econometric techniques work. What about agricultural sector? You almost don't see the blue line, right? The blue portion somewhere surfaces around 2013, 2014, but it's almost negligible. So something is terribly wrong with the farming sector, right, across the country. Maybe something is wrong. That's something which we get an idea right looking at the data, right? And if you're just trying to track this not from the last 5 years, but from 1990 per se, we get an idea that it's not as if that agricultural sector was doing bad right from the 1980s. There was a period of time between 1990, 2009, and 11 that agriculture was significantly contributing towards the overall income levels. As I pointed out earlier, at the time of independence, 80% of the labor was employed in the agricultural sector. Right now, almost 44% of India's aggregate labor is employed by the agricultural sector itself, right? That's a substantial number. It's almost half of your population, right? And that's contributing the least to the amount of the overall income capacities, right? Service sector has grown and industry hasn't. Now, what's happened to income within the agricultural sector? This is just a chart giving you an idea between the last 2 decades. So I'm just looking at 2010 and 2018. You see that the line, which is the black line, we usually call it a trend. It's pointing at a higher direction, which is almost stagnant, right? So in other words, nothing has happened in the agriculture sector. We can always call it the lost decade. You've not done anything in terms of developing the life of farmers. And one of the criticism that seems to come out, and it's there in the literature as well, is that most of farming is not seen as an enterprise by itself. You will see most of the developed societies invested heavily in farming because they felt that this is an enterprise which needs to yield profit to the manufacturer or the person who's producing crops. And unless and until he or she does not get profits, how is that one can produce? In India's context, and this is important, that agricultural income is exempted from tax, which gives the state absolute authority to be able to produce from farmers across states at the price at which the state wants. The farmer is more or less free, right? So the fields that you see around, you can see the farmer is free to go to the market and sell the produce himself or herself, but the state does much little in that regard. It's only in the last few years there has been a lot of discussion in this process. So growth in the agricultural sector has not picked up. That's one point of the narrative that one can point out. But what's happening with manufacturing sector? Yes, the manufacturing sector over the last decade per se, not in the 90s, but in 2000s, definitely picked up in its performance. And you see that with the performance primarily of 2 industries. You can talk about the drug market, not drugs on the other side, but the pharmaceutical market. And the other is the automobile markets. That's something which you would call as, so you'd find a lot of cars in Delhi, right? I think there is 33 lakhs, I don't know how to, 330,000 cars bought in 1 year in Delhi alone, right? That's a significant number, right? And there's a whole lot of discussion on how pollution levels are rising, but that's one of the points that you can look upon. But one of the reasons why is because the automobile market in India is huge, not only for foreign companies investing, but also for the Indian companies that have grown. Most of the companies that you would observe are in joint ventures or in mergers with Indian companies. Suzuki, Maruti, Hero, Honda, I mean, they're separated now, but most of them, the way in which they started business was through mergers and acquisitions. So manufacturing sector growth has been driven by these 2 sectors primarily. And one activity which has really picked up over the last 2 decades has been the construction sector, which makes almost 60% of India's labor population extremely vulnerable. Now you have to very carefully observe whenever you pass through a construction site here. I think you must have by now somewhere. Have you seen construction happening somewhere? What would be your observation? How different is it from construction anywhere you've seen?
There's no safety precautions taken at all, and what I find surprising is how their children are just sitting around with it. We'd never see that.
So it's the most vulnerable activity. You'd agree to it? Because almost 70 to 80% of the people, and this is I'm being cautiously optimistic, of the number of people employed are a part of the unorganized sector. That means these are people who are at some point in time working in the farms, helping people grow crops in a season, and then migrating in flocks to work in construction activity on a day-to-day wage basis, right? And this is something which has been largely discussed in the globalization discourse and its impact on the developing sector under the idea, and you're students of law, so I think somewhere you can look at the clause of subcontracting, If you look at the history of subcontracting in India, Brazil, most of these countries, the growth in construction sector has been directly proportional to how subcontracting has happened. You were saying something? Yeah.
Yep. How have is there a development of the idea of unions in the construction industry?
Which was there till the 70s, then most of the unionization started disintegrating. And primarily, I think one of the things that you see that happened as a result of what we call as the globalization story, right from the US till almost every other major country, major producing country, is that unions started disappearing, right? You see with the Reagan campaign as well in the 70s, 80s, most of the unions were lost their voice in the collective bargaining process. And as a result of the notion of the private enterprise, which could not be directed except in the minimum employment clause or minimum wage clause. So you have to pay X amount of money as the minimum wage to an employee. But till the time you're doing that, it doesn't matter what kind of a contract you have. So no health coverage, no social insurance, no social security for yourself or your kids, right? Most of these were points that were raised by the trade unions or the unions as a part of the collective bargaining process. But this is a larger story, not restricted to India alone. But you see that it plays extremely predominantly in the Indian story. Why? Because our growth in the construction and manufacturing sector began after 90s. So this is correlating with the globalization story as well. And who is primarily investing in construction are not only Indian companies, but primarily multinational companies as well who were able to. There's a brilliant article. I don't know if you guys want to just skim through this. It's published yesterday in Project Syndicate. I don't know if you know this portal. It's a digital, I don't know if you guys are aware, but Project Syndicate is an online digital portal which publishes articles from the leading political scientists, economists, and sociologists from the world, right? You must have heard of Joseph Stiglitz. You must have heard of Amartya Sen. You must have heard of most of these people who've done considerable work. There's a political economist by the name of Danny Roderick. I don't know if you know, but Danny Roderick wrote a piece yesterday in defense of economic populism, right? And he's built up a case there where a certain level of economic populism is needed to protect the vulnerability coming from the implementation of investments from multinational companies. So he's distinguished between what is seen as political populism, that's something which is right now in a lot of discourse, but as economic populism as well. So the issue of subcontracting allows the construction sector to grow, and this is also correlated with the manufacturing story. Let me discuss one more point before I see you have next 5 minutes. Let me link this with the employment scenario. Now, why is it important to talk about employment is because the last 1.5 years, the current government has been swarmed with criticism on its failure to create new jobs, right? And the failure to create new jobs across sectors is something which spills over to the way in which policies have been designed and implemented across sectors. So while there has been a lot done in areas of services, you will find some of the most sophisticated debates on artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics here. You just have to take a flight from Delhi to Bangalore. Even in Delhi, you can find that. So some seminars are fantastic. So there's a level of sophistication on a discourse of that level, which is kind of seen as the fourth industrial revolution. And then you have to also go to a farm nearby and see how farming is happening, which is basically using manual tools from the 19th century to be able to plow, right? So that's the level of gap because most policies have targeted the service sector that's been feeding into the revenue standard. The employment structure scenario, you see, has only picked up largely in the service sector, but the service sector overall employs less than 20% of the Indian population. And when I say Indian population, that means the educated Indian population. While 44% is in the agriculture, around 24% in the manufacturing sector, okay? And that's not changed over the last decade. The numbers I'm showing you from the employment scenario, employment data in India, unfortunately, is only available once in 10 years because we depend on census data. We can't do, like what you have in the US is an annual employment scenario. I think Australia has a very similar, I don't know if how often do you have employment?
3 or 5 years.
5 years? Yeah, 3 or 5 years. We have sampling done in 3 or 5, but it's based on the original sample, and that's quite distorted. So the last time the numbers were, let's say, punched out were 2010 and 11. Even that time we saw that the scenario, and last few years it has worsened. So what you do see, if you divide the understanding of what we mean as public, that is one which is owned by the government or is controlled through public sector undertakings, and you look at the private sector, most jobs that have been created in the last 2 decades or 3 decades, since we talked about the role of privatization, liberalization, and globalization, the entire world happening, has been not in the private sector but in the public sector. If you just look at the chart here, public sector job growth was in negative, which has turned more positive over the last couple of years, while in the private sector the scenario has lessened. So there has been less jobs created in the private sector, and one of the explanation for this point is, in the private sector it is easier to get one machine as against employing 100 people, right, to be able to do the same job. And most Indian manufacturers in the private sector have moved towards capital intensive method of production across the board, as against using labor intensive techniques. When I use the word labor intensive, that means more people are employed. Only countries like Taiwan and Hong Kong have been able to balance the gap between what, and these are very small nations, I mean, you can talk about Singapore as well in the same light. They've been able to adopt technology which is based for the society that the society needs. In this context, because the demand has been to produce faster at a more of a quality standard, capital intensive methods have thriven. So jobs created in the private sector is less. What is more is jobs created in the construction sector through the subcontracting system, which keeps most of the population more or less vulnerable. All right. So let me stop right here. I don't want to discuss issues of gender inequality right now. Let me start the next discussion probably by this. I'm not quite sure how much time would I be able to have. Yeah, okay. But let me just go back and quickly sum up what we were discussing. I started our discussion largely by looking at how in the method of economic analysis we need more narratives to be a part of it. Stories of individual countries or societies, something which helps us to gauge whether a policy or a standard is working or not working, right? What kind of perspectives do narratives provide? And this is likely to be clearer when we have the second presentation of individual market case studies in Delhi, which is something I'll do then, that you'll understand the humanist perspective or the agency perspective there. The idea was then to look at how India's growth narrative has figured out. So India's growth narrative was something that we started our discussion by talking about 4 or 5 major challenges that is shaping up. The scenario which seems to be defining most of the challenges to the economy today seem to be structural in nature over the last 4 to 5 decades. One seems to be in a performance mismatch. It's where the growth or the transition of growth you've not seen happening from the agricultural sector to services. In fact, at this point, you see it to be in a reverse order, right? So that's something which has not gone around to the conventional path in which you understand growth. Second is the nature of the employment challenges that the country faces, both in different sectors, that is of agricultural, manufacturing, and industry. And the next point that we will discuss probably is how the female to male and male to female participation in the labor force has been affected. The numbers are staggering, but if you just look at what's happening, almost 60% of women are employed only in the agricultural sector, and that in the most vulnerable positions, right? And that's been worsening over the last 5-6 years, right? When I say worsening, that means less and less women are working in the part of the formal, organized, regulated structure. And the only thing I think probably to finish our discussion would be to distinguish the idea of what we understand as formal and informal. When I'm using the word formal, it means something which is what? More regulated, is more transparent, is accountable, leaves a paper trail for the least. So most of your transactions in buying, let's say, cheap alcohol or whatever, don't buy it, but If you do make that effort, will be what? These will be creditless transactions. You will not receive a bill or an invoice. If you ask, he'll probably laugh at you, but that's fine. So that's a part of an informal, unregulated, unorganized segment, right? In the Indian context, that's the predominant sector that you see, right? And when you look at the gender divide story, most women are only absorbed and participatory of the informal sector. And that's why they're not captured adequately by the current data as well. That's a big challenge, right? Which most governments have. Most of these points are not being talked about. The nourishment story and most of those things. So any questions that you have before we can, I think you have an interaction. Yeah. I had timed myself half an hour, but I guess I'm back half an hour because of the discussion, but we'll probably discuss it after lunch. But any questions thus far? Were you able to follow what we were discussing? Did it ring some bell? Is it anything that you have to say? Is it just too cold? Just too cold. I mean, we're battling. I mean, you would like to say more, but probably it's just that you need to talk and you need to say something. All right. So, yeah. Were you able to follow what we were discussing? Okay, fine. So we'll pick up from here. We've discussed 2 points right here, and at around 2 o'clock when we meet, I'll probably quickly walk through these before we look at specific market case studies in a few cases in Delhi. I think you have a scheduled visit to Delhi, and because we'll be discussing one of the markets to give you an idea of how people conduct exchange of goods, one market you do have to visit, and most of you have to visit, is the old market in Chandni Chowk. You have to go to Old Delhi because that's where the real chaos comes in. See, chaos has a very interesting way of how it works in India. There's a theory of chaos we have, that it's a cosmic chaos, but everything, while it is completely disorganized, somehow works, right? And everything works. So you have to go to that part. That's the Old Delhi part, from where the Mughal capital was there. And then just one market that you have to also look at is the market of Delhi Haat, where you can do most of your shopping because it's a clearly demarcated area selling traditional, authentic Indian goods from different states. So the 2 markets you can look at is, one is Delhi Haat, right? Haat is seen as a market, it's a word, right? It's near INA stadium, right? You can go there at some point of time. You have one visit to Delhi SC which has nothing planned. So when you can go as a group. So what we will be discussing in the presentation, I'll show you some pictures on how the market activity works. It's bizarre. At the same time, it breaks through any conventional way how you understand economic reasoning and behavior, okay? Because bargaining plays a key role in how you determine the price. You can't sit in an auto rickshaw and say that take me there, point A to point B, and this is what I'm going to charge. That person may charge a different rate from each one of you, including myself, at a given point of time. There is no demand-supply mechanism. It's basically entirely on person-to-person negotiation, right? So it's an interesting place, all right? Okay, fine. We'll meet after lunch. Thank you, guys. Thank you.